Hi there, welcome to HUD's History. Today we're going to be looking at the Russian Revolution. Now, the revolution takes place in the midst of World War One. So they leave the war in order to deal with their internal crises. If you go to the World War One video, you can see what was going on there, and you know that this is going on at the same time. So there's a totally different video between World War One and Russian Revolution, only because the Russian Revolution is its own big event that takes place. So if you want to follow along, awesome. Make sure you like this video and subscribe so you can get any other videos for world history. The Russian Revolution is one of those important events in the 20th century. Why? Because it changed the face of an entire nation, entire people, and it changed the direction of what would happen later on in the 20th century. So as you go through the Russian Revolution, you have to understand the implications that it had, not just for the people in Russia at the time, but also for the broader global population. So you have to think about what was the cause of this revolution. Like, why had people tried to revolt previously? Well, we know that the Russian czars had been pretty much cool and oppressive all throughout the 18th and 19th centuries of the rule. We know that there were a lot of inequities, specifically in the Russian society. And there are these events, plus a few other things that are going to lead to civil and social unrest within Russia that's going to lead to the rise of people who are trying to make changes against the reigning family, which is the Romanov family. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background before that revolution, in the 19th century, you had revolutionaries who undertook the ideas of Karl Marx and were trying to make changes themselves throughout Russia. They tried to assassinate the Tsar at the time in 1881. His name was Tsar Alexander II. He had tried to institute some reforms in Russia, but in places where he saw rebellion, he tried to implement martial law to try and control those places. This is Tsar Alexander II in this picture, and as you can see, he has a wonderful mustache. His son, Tsar Alexander III, comes to power, and he continues on with that totalitarian type of thinking. He has secret police monitor the schools. There is no freedom of the press, even though the Enlightenment had gone through in the late 18th century, and a lot of monarchs were trying to basically adhere to these ideals. He did not. He also mandated that people in Russia had to be part of the Russian Orthodox Church, so that is the given religion at the time. Anybody who he saw as a political prisoner, he did not just arrest them. He actually sent them to Siberia. And what you have to know about Siberia is there was a train to get there and to get back. But other than that, once you were in Siberia, they literally did not have like prison guards at the exits because the winters were so harsh that if you tried to leave, you would just end up freezing to death. So, good place to have a prison, apparently. And then he mandated that Russian was the official language, even though there are a lot of dialects spoken, and because of the fact that there are a diverse group of people from the European part of Russia all the way to the Asian part of Russia, and they speak in different dialects and even some different languages, he made sure that everything was done according to the official language of Russia. Unfortunately, you're going to see a religious minority that's going to be persecuted at this time. That is going to be the Jewish population. We know that they are targeted throughout history, and this is no exception. They're going to actually organize violence against the Jews. They're known as pogroms, especially in places like Ukraine, when they try and take over Ukraine, and that becomes an issue for the Tsar as he tries to maintain control of his empire. Now, there's a group known as the People's Will, and they try to plan the Tsar's murder. So again, you have assassination attempts on the royal family. It was unsuccessful, and one of the conspirators was actually caught and then hanged for his execution. Who is that person? His name is Alexander Ulyanov, and it's ironic because this is the brother of Vladimir Ulyanov, who otherwise becomes known as Vladimir Lenin, who will actually lead the revolution in 1917 and become the leader of the new Soviet Union. So it's interesting that his brother was one who tried to implement change earlier and was basically executed because of his try to make things different. And his brother Lenin is going to end up becoming basically the president of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, this Tsar, he is going to die from nephritis. He actually was injured in a train derailment that was trying to use to plot the assassination, and that led to a lot of issues later on. Nephritis is a kidney disease, and that's what he's going to die from. Here is the brother Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Vladimir Lenin later. He's arrested for an attempted assassination as well later in 1895. He is going to not be executed. He's going to be imprisoned and exiled to Siberia. While he's in jail, he's actually going to lay the groundwork. He is going to write the principles of what he thinks should be the new rise of the Socialist Party in Russia. And he takes on the name Vladimir Lenin as his basically his character and his value of who he is. Now, the new Tsar comes to power, Nicholas II. He is going to take power, and you would think after the last two Tsars had assassination attempts that Nicholas II would come to the throne and try to make some changes, but he doesn't. And why is that? Well, one, he is stubborn and he doesn't want to share power. You have to understand that under most authoritarian regimes, the power is centralized usually in one person or a small group. And with the Enlightenment in the 18th century, it was this idea that you had elected people that would represent the public and do what's best for the people, and that a government by the people was the best. Unfortunately, Nicholas II doesn't really listen when he comes to power, and he's very stubborn about it. He also doesn't see that there were times that were a changing. The rest of Europe had become industrialized and had factories and were building up their militaries, getting new weapons, new technologies, such as incandescent light bulbs, things of that nature. But he is late to the game when it comes to this. He's going to make some attempts later, but it's going to be too late. And finally, he just believed that the traditions of Russia is going to keep it strong. He basically thinks that, well, Russia's been here for the last, how many hundreds of years, and his family has basically ruled since 1650s or so. And why would he change anything? Because his family has ruled and there's no need to make any changes. So if you think about how he was, and if you think about why he doesn't change policies, you have to understand that he had advisors, and who knows what they tried to tell him, but they were not very good, or he just didn't want to listen to them. Probably a little bit of A, a little bit of B. So if you were the advisor, how do you get the Tsar to make changes, to understand that his empire is basically in trouble? So now you have to catch up to the Western world, right? Because of industrialization that's going on in the West, Russia realizes at basically the lateness of the times that they don't have the same type of technologies that are going on in the rest of the world. He introduces a new minister. This is going to be Sergei Witt. And Sergei Witt is going to be the minister to basically implement change in infrastructure. he is going to make sure that the transportation and factory systems are going to be up to par with the rest of Europe. He has them build more railroads so that they can move people around faster. He's also going to double the amount of factories that are in Russia at the time. Now, unfortunately, this is not going to help them by the time you get into World War I, and that's going to be a very big detriment to their fighting and their ability to maintain an offensive against the Germans and the Austrians. Does this modernization help in Russia? Well, no, of course it doesn't. Why? Because there's too many problems. We've seen this through the Industrial Revolution. There are too many grueling working conditions. There are low wages because the factory workers do not get paid very much. There is a lot of use of child labor, even though most other countries are starting to phase out child labor. The Russians do not. There becomes an increasing gap between the rich and the poor. You start to see that class warfare happening here in Russia that you had seen in the western part of Europe during the rise of the First Industrial Revolution. So, because of these differences and changes that are going on, the underbelly of revolutionary movements are going to start to surface. So you're going to have groups that are going to try and make changes throughout the time, but there are different groups that want to do different things. And you're going to have the rise of two groups in the early 20th century. You're going to have what are known as the Mensheviks. These are people who want change and maybe a revolution, but they want broad support, meaning they want to make changes, implement them, get the population on their side, and then make the overall change in the government. Unfortunately, they were battling against the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were a small group, and they were basically wanting to sacrifice whatever they could for a quick, radical change. And unfortunately, we're going to see who wins in that battle. The leader of the Bolsheviks is Vladimir Lenin, and this is a depiction of him with some of his fellow Bolsheviks. Now, there are three major crises that are going to affect Russia and basically lead to this overall change of government and to a revolution. The first is the Russo-Japanese War. This happens in 1904, and it is the Russians who are fighting the Japanese in Korea and the Manchurian territory in China. It's basically over a train railroad system. They were trying to get further into to a port city for their stuff, for their exports. Japan didn't believe they should be able to go through the place that they controlled, and so you had this fight between the Russians and the Japanese. The Russians obviously are a very big country compared to Japan, but Japan ends up winning this battle, and it is a serious blow to the leadership of the Tsar, because people in Russia can't believe that they've lost a war to the Japanese. So that's the first instance. The next thing that happens is what's known as Bloody Sunday. In January of 1905, you have a crowd that goes to the Winter Palace where the Tsar is, and they're petitioning the Tsar because they want better wages, better working conditions. Well, unfortunately, they are not allowed to go into the palace, and the soldiers end up under orders firing on the crowd. And in the chaos that ensues, you have a bunch of people in the streets who end up being wounded or killed. And the estimates are not exact because of the fact that the records aren't there, but they believe anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people were killed in this one incident. So you have the defeat of the Russian military by the Japanese. You have the Russian military firing on civilians. Those are two huge pieces. The last thing that's going to lead to the revolution is going to be World War I. And That's because Tsar Nicholas, he dragged Russia in completely unprepared. But because he had the alliance agreement with Serbia, he really had no choice in getting involved. There were a lot of high costs, and we know that the Russians are not very good offensively. They suffered their defeat in Germany, even though they push into it very quickly. They suffer their defeats in Austria-Hungary, even though they go in very quickly. They are pushed back very easily by the Germans and the Austrians. So what does the Tsar do? He decides to move his headquarters to the front so he can take personal command of what's going on. He doesn't think his military generals are doing an appropriate job with the fighting. So he decides to leave his wife, the Tsarina, in charge of the government. Now, Tsarina Alexandria, she is a very noble woman. She has been educated, but she does not have the political acumen to run the government in a way that should have been run. Do you think this decision that he leaves her to run the government to be a benefit? I mean, he only gives his power to his wife because he doesn't really trust anybody else. And he knows his wife will make decisions, or so he believes, that will benefit the Russian people and basically keep the family in power itself. Now, the Tsarina does not listen to the Tsar's advisors. Why? I don't know. Well, I do know. It's mostly because she relied on one person. She relied on her own advisor, who was a self-proclaimed holy man. His name was Rasputin, which you've probably either seen in the Anastasia movie, or you've read through other things, or seen in other visuals. Rasputin was this really weird guy who basically was able to kind of put people under a spell. He was a mystic. And he was able to help her son who had hemophilia, which is a disease where if you fall and you get cut, your blood doesn't clot, so you can bleed out basically. And so she felt that he could always help her son out because he would calm the son when he would have these fits and seizures and whatnot. But unfortunately, nobody else liked Rasputin. The nobles thought he was trying to do what he could for himself, that it wasn't for the benefit of the people. And the decisions that he made, that the advice he gives to the Tsarina, actually crushed the economy in Russia, which is not very good. Inflation is skyrocketing, which means that the ruble is crashing, and it takes a lot more of them to buy things. Think of what will happen in the Weimar Republic in Germany after World War I, same type of thing. The morale of the troops becomes very low, and they start to mutiny. They decide they don't want to fight this war anymore. And it's just a continual downward spiral in the overall state of the Russian Empire. So what do? The nobles decide that they need to get rid of Rasputin because they fear that he's going to be the destruction of the empire, which, a little bit of foreshadowing, there you go. They have plotted an assassination against him. So what they do is they bring him down to a meeting in an apartment. They actually poison the food and drink that they had for him. He realizes that something wrong is going on. The poison doesn't seem to be working. He takes off. As he's running away, they shoot at him, and he's supposedly shot several different times, but he is not necessarily dead. They think he's dead, so they take his body and they throw him into the river, which was frozen over. His body is later found, but they determined that his cause of death wasn't actually from the shooting or the poison. They found that his fingernails had basically been stripped down, like he had been trying to scratch his way out of the ice, and his lungs were filled with water. So they believe that the true cause of his death was actually drowning. The final blow of this Russian state is going to be in 1917. Women begin to strike in Petrograd because there's no bread. There's also no fuel. And in March, it's still cold in Russia, unfortunately. 200,000 people will start rioting, including soldiers. And Tsar Nicholas realized that he is not going to be able to sustain his power. And he makes an agreement with a group of members in the government, and they decide that he will abdicate the throne and his family will be put into exile. And so they are taken into custody, and unfortunately they are later executed under the orders of Lenin. Now, there's all the conspiracies about, was Anastasia still alive because her body was never found? They actually found the bodies later on. There have been instances where, you have women who claim that they've been Anastasia, and then they give all these, accounts, but then their DNA is tested and it's not even matched. They used Prince Philip of England, who's was married to the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, because he is related to the family. So his blood was actually used. He actually donated in order to test anybody who claimed that they were of the family. So there you go, a little side trivia for you. The provisional government takes over in 1917, and the Petrograd Soviet, which is known as the Workers' Council, it forms. The government was a center-left government, but they didn't really feel like the nation was ready for a full-on conversion to socialism. They had what's known as dual power. They decided to put in some reforms. They wanted to put an end to discrimination. They wanted to include free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, things of that nature. So during this time, Lenin had been exiled to Germany. He had escaped because of the fact that he did not want to be executed by the Russian authorities and by the Tsar at the time. But he gets exiled to Germany. He sees what's going on during this revolution of the provisional government, and the Germans decide that they're going to help get him back into Russia. So they do. They put him into a sealed train car and they push him there. Why is the German government willing to help this crazy man? Because they don't want him to cause unrest in Germany. They don't like socialism. They don't think it's a good thing. And so they're like, get out of here. They also felt that if he went back and the Bolsheviks took power, it would make Russia weaker. And that would be beneficial to Germany, who obviously wants to control what's going on in the war. Lenin comes back and he tries a new revolution, but unfortunately this revolution kind of fails, and he decides that it is not under his name. He just owns this whole new revolution, and he flees again to Finland because the provisional government threatens him with arrest. I mean, how many times are you going to leave? His colleague by the name of Leon Trotsky, he's actually arrested himself. Here is Leon Trotsky. He will become known as Lenin's right-hand man. Well, that's good until we get to October of 1917, where you have yet another revolution taking place within Russia. The workers become angry with the provisional government because they're not doing what they say. Lenin decides to return from Finland. He believes that this is a new chance at revolution, and he believes that you can have a new government to implement his policies. Now, they start a new civil war, and they do that with the taking over of the Winter Palace, which had been the seat of the provisional government. It becomes a Menshevik versus Bolshevik type of battle, and they become known as the White versus the Red Army. The two groups are going to fight each other, and it's going to basically pit this Bolshevik Red Army against the Menshevik White Army. However, the Mensheviks had support from the US, Britain, France, Japan. Why? Because they saw that the Mensheviks were not as extreme as the Bolsheviks, and they figured that they'd have a better chance of relations with the Mensheviks in power than the Bolsheviks in power. it was at this point that the Romanov family is executed on orders of Lenin, and they are killed with no chance of an imperial family coming back to the throne. Having these two armies at each other's throats, you would assume that the White Army would have some advantage because of the fact that they are supported by these other countries. But that just makes Lenin more powerful, because he's saying that these other countries want this type, but not the Russian people or a government. And so he basically leads with a slogan in order to get the people on his side. That slogan is peace, land, and bread. He basically says, if you put us in power, we will give you peace from this war, we will give you land that is yours, and we will give you the bread that you haven't had due to the idiocy of the provisional government. So he gains the support of the population and is able to take control of the government. So the Red Army is going to win, and they take over the Winter Palace. The provisional government leaders try to flee. Some of them are actually captured and executed or imprisoned. Lenin is named as the chairman of the new government, which is known as the Council of People's Commissars, and his right-hand man becomes Leon Trotsky, who will be basically important as he implements his policies based off the ideas of Marxism. Russia will become the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, or the Soviet Union as we know it. So that is how the Russian Revolution takes place, how you go from an imperial government led by the Romanov family into what is becoming a communist party known as the Soviet Union. So think about a couple of things. Was the fall of this monarch inevitable, or could it have been saved? Because there are probably some things he could have done differently that would have saved his family, would have saved his empire, and he could have modernized it into more of a constitutional monarchy if he had really attempted to do so and not been so stubborn. All he had to do was actually look to his cousin, who was the King of England at the time, and seeing how they were ruling, because they had ruled England for quite a while themselves. What problems were foreseeable to the Tsar but were ignored? Obviously, hindsight is 2020, but there were some things that were going on that the Tsar probably could have taken care of if he had basically not been so stubborn. And the population had some legitimate concerns. If he had listened to the public and realized that things needed to be changed, he may not have had such a pushback from the population, especially after the Russo War with Japan and the Bloody Sunday event that occurred. And going into World War I, he may have had more support if he had done some changes to the population concerns. So that's how we get to the Soviet Union from Imperial Russia. So that's how the Russian Revolution takes place. That's how we see it go from ruling by a Tsar to ruling by, well, the CCP, the Communist Party of Russia, which becomes the Soviet Union. And we see that it's going to change the events that lead into the rest of the 20th century because of the ideas that Lenin brings to the Soviet Union and how he treats other people and other countries. Because even though they try to make changes for the better from what they thought were bad under the Tsar, it's actually not going to be any better. And in fact, there are in some ways it's going to become even worse under a Soviet government ruled by socialists. So there you go. That is the Russian Revolution. Your social tip for the day is eat healthy. Make sure that you are getting your vitamins. Make sure that you are make sure that you are not eating as many sugar-free foods. Make sure you drink plenty of water, and make sure you get your exercise in so you can live a long and happy life. So for Hud's History, I'm Mr. Hudson. Remember, like this page, subscribe so you can see any other videos. Until next time, have a good one.